As a music technician, I've recorded and mixed many small bands and solo performances. Through mixing, I've identified the best practices and the most effective ways of making the recording process efficient and flexible. In this video, I'll go over my process of how I set up for recording sessions spread over 2 days to capture 9 to 10 performances. Today is day 2 of recording. I used a similar setup on day 1, which was a week ago, so I will try and replicate last week's setup and make some improvements to it. When I start to set up for recording, I ask myself what I'm trying to achieve. In this session, I want to have a clear and well isolated mix. This is very general, but it helps me stay focused and guides the decisions I make. I also tend to note down the number of performances in each song and the instruments they'll be using. I tend to do this on paper as I find it to be quick and easy to make changes to. Next is to figure out monitoring. Is there going to be monitoring? Is it IEMs or wedges? Or is it a mix of both? These are important to figure out first. Wedges allow for greater flexibility during performing, while IEMs allow for greater control and isolation. In last week's session, I used a hybrid system. The singer, guitarist, and the bassist used wired headphones, and the drummer used a wedge monitor. Figuring out monitoring is important, so I do this first, as this will further guide my mic choices and positions. One final thing to consider is if there are any special tech requirements, such as backing tracks and the use of MIDI technology. I will list any special requirements at the bottom to tackle them once everything is set up. For this session, there are 2 main requirements. 1. The performance has to be one take. No overdubs or re-recording of any parts is allowed. And 2. Use of a click track for the drummer. The drummer needs to hear a click track while the rest of the band doesn't. Microphones and placement. I use a variety of dynamic and large condenser microphones. I am familiar with the Shure microphones and have used them a lot in the past as they have always worked reliably for recording. Recently, we invested in some cheap, small condenser Behringer microphones and I'm very impressed with them. I reserve the use of large condenser microphones on instruments and only use them to capture the room. This is because while mixing, I noticed one way to reduce instrument bleed is to not mic everything. This is from personal experience, but I find that the more mics I use, the less isolated the mix becomes. The instrument bleed, however low level it may be, gets picked up by the mics and makes the mix sound very ambient and reduces the overall clarity of the mix. Mic placement is also important. While setting up, I look at the pickup patterns of the mics I'm using and position them for maximum rejection from other instruments. In some cases, it's not possible, but it helps me to keep the pickup patterns in the back of my mind as a reference. As the dynamic mics have a smaller pickup pattern, I can afford to be less cautious, so I will set them up last. While thinking about mic placement, another thing to consider is whether the sound source is loud or quiet. For the electric guitar, I can worry less about instrument bleed as the electric guitar is very loud and will drown out the bleed anyway. But for something like finger-picking acoustic guitar in a band setting, I'll need to isolate it as much as possible. DI boxes and converters. I rarely use DI boxes during recording as I find that the preamps on most modern recording interfaces are versatile and can handle mic and line level signals just fine. Converters like DI boxes introduce more electrical components and cables, which can lead to a higher chance of increasing the noise floor if not set properly. In this session, I've used one stereo DI box to convert a stereo instrument signal into a mono left and right XLR balanced signal. Jack to jacks versus XLRs. In the recording space, I use jack to jacks where appropriate and stick to XLR cables as they are balanced. As the space is fairly small, I don't need to convert every jack to jack cable input into XLR, as the short jack cables don't introduce any interference. Drums. In the previous session, I placed the overhead mics over the snare in an XY configuration. This is done to create a stereo image of the drum kit. In this session, I'll place the small condensers in a spaced pair to pick up the drum kit in a different way. I don't use the large condenser mics like the Rode NT1A as it will pick up too much instrument bleed and the mix from the wedge monitor. I use small condenser microphones placed fairly close to the drums to isolate them from the rest of the band. Along with the overheads, 2 additional mics are placed. One inside the kick and another at the snare bottom. This is because the overhead mics pick up the whole drum kit well, and the individual mics help support each element of the kit, kick and snare. To help with isolation, I tend not to overcompress the overheads, but instead EQ the kick or snare mic to shape the drum sound. Keyboards and bass DI. We don't have an acoustic piano, so to keep things simple, I use the aux out from the keyboard and connect it to the mixer directly. I always record any keyboard or synth instrument in stereo, as I find when I pan them left and right, it gives the instrument a nice sense of space, which can't be achieved with a mono signal. I don't use the DI box here to save cables and to help declutter the space. I plug headphones into the headphone port, as using the aux out from the keyboard doesn't mute it. On other keyboards, there may be a switch to turn off the built-in speakers, so I'll use that too. Acoustic guitars, stereo versus mono. Dynamic mics on acoustic guitars sound great. My pick is the SM57 placed either in the 12th fret of the guitar or close mic'd to the body near the 12th fret. Recently, I've experimented with the small condenser mics we bought to record acoustic guitars, and I've been very impressed with the results. The stereo matched pair of small condenser mics allow for easy stereo recording, and I will use this where appropriate. I only use large condenser mics when recording mid-side, but generally I stick to XY or spaced pair mic positions. There are many mic positions that can be used to capture the sound of the acoustic guitar, but for this session, I'll use a dynamic mic and record it in mono, as the acoustic guitar is not the main instrument in this session. Electric guitars. For electric guitars, an SM57 is used and placed near the edge of the amp. I try to place the mic as close to the amp as possible to reduce any background bleed from other instruments. If the guitarist is using a pedal board, I'll try and get a direct out from the pedal board, as this is the most isolated signal and can be blended in with the mic recording. The electric guitar tone is achieved on the amp EQ, so that EQ is not used during mixing. Sometimes I will use two mics on the amp if the guitarist is playing a solo or using overdrive on their pedal board. The secondary mic's gain is set lower than the primary to create a safety margin if the guitar becomes too loud and begins to clip the primary mic. Miking electric guitar amps is one aspect that I'm not too experienced in. I'd like to experiment with different mic positions, either close or further away from the speaker, to understand the difference in tone in greater detail. Vocals. This takes a lot of experimenting with the singer. I usually start with the SM58 or the Rode NT1A as a baseline, and depending on the type of voice, I'll choose the mic with the most appropriate frequency response. I'll sometimes experiment with multi-miking the vocals with a dynamic and a small condenser mic, if I'm not sure which one would work best for isolation and tone. A pop filter is used, even on the SM58, to reduce plosives. As the vocals are the most important part of this session, I'll try to isolate them as much as I can at this stage. Ideally, I would place the singer in a separate room, but in this session, it's more advantageous for the performers to be in the same space as they can see each other, which results in a more authentic and natural sounding final take. Recording gear. While talking about recording, I think it's important to mention the gear I've used. Previously, I used the M-Audio 8-input interface, which was a reliable unit and was set up to always be connected to the recording spaces via a normal system. However, it was not great for having monitoring mixes for individual performers. Over the recent 2 recording sessions, I've used the Allen & Heath digital mixer for recording and monitoring of the band members. The setup with the digital mixer was incredibly smooth, and the wireless connectivity allowed for easier setting of the gain and mic placement with the CQ Mixpad app. We also used the CQ4U app for monitoring, and I gave each performer their mix to adjust through the headphones, with the drummer's mix coming through the wedge, which was very reliable throughout the whole session. But ultimately, it's the skills, knowledge, and planning that are crucial to get the best recording out of a session. I've been recording bands for a couple of years now, but while learning to record, some key terms always confused me and held me back. Here's a video explaining them if you'd like to learn more. Thanks for watching.